The conduct was horrendous, inhumane, and nothing short of evil.
Pat, the judge told that couple that he hopes that they wake up at night and are tortured by thoughts of what they've done to this young boy.
I don't assign number 28 to another student because I feel it is only his number now. And it's a way for me to honor him in my classroom.
Three boys, three little coffins, endless corruption. The world is still searching for accountability that may never come. This docuseries highlights three of the worst child murder cases in LA County: Anthony Avalos, Noah Cuatro, and Gabriel Fernandez, all from the same forgotten desert region, Antelope Valley. But these are just the names we know. There are countless other children whose stories are buried in the case files we'll never see, whose names were never spoken, whose pain was never acknowledged. By exposing these three cases, we're pulling back the curtain on a systemic crisis, not just of depraved parents in a broken family structure, but the corruption embedded in CPS, a system we fund, a system hiding behind the facade of protecting children while siphoning money into the pockets of a network of the most devious. They are all profiting off the pain and suffering of our babies, and I've had enough. Behind the heartbreak lies a deeper truth. Corruption didn't just allow these tragedies, it protected those responsible. Agencies failed, records vanished, accountability was replaced with silence. These stories are not easy to hear, but silence is no longer an option. This episode is not just a documentary, it's a reckoning. In part 1, we told the tragic story of Anthony Avalos, who screamed for help over and over again, but was ignored and sadly left to die. In part 2, we uncovered the egregious and purposeful actions of CPS to send little 4-year-old Noah Cuatro back into the hands of monsters, not because they believed he was safe, but because he was inconvenient. So instead of protecting them, they discarded them and made calculated decisions to let them die. But there's another innocent boy we need to cover, probably the worst case of depravity and human suffering inflicted on a child ever thrust into the public forum. This is part 3, Gabriel. Before we talk about Gabriel, we need to talk about Pearl. Not the mother she claimed to be, but what may have played a role in the monster she became. This isn't about excusing her, it's about understanding how someone becomes capable of such cruelty. Because what happened to Gabriel Fernandez isn't just shocking, it's soul-shattering. It defies logic, it defies humanity, and it leaves behind a trail of questions that demand answers. To find those answers, we have to peel back every layer of this nightmare, starting with the generational wounds that shaped Pearl and confront the ugliness buried in Gabriel's family tree. Pearl Cynthia Fernandez was born on August 29, 1983, in the scorched heart of LA County's Antelope Valley, a place where the desert doesn't just burn your skin, its dust buries secrets. 60 miles from the glitter of Los Angeles, Antelope Valley is a patchwork of forgotten cities. Palmdale is one of them, and this is where the story begins. Palmdale isn't just dry land and desert brush. It's a city haunted by poverty, gang violence, and a sheriff's department riddled with corruption. It's a place where justice is often delayed or denied, where children slip through the cracks and families fracture under the weight of generational trauma. If you haven't already, go back and watch part 1 of this docuseries. There I peel back the layers of Palmdale's history, the ugliness beneath its sun-bleached surface, because before we can begin to unravel what happened to Gabriel, we have to confront the shadows that raised his mother. Pearl grew up in a home where violence wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Her father was in and out of prison. Her mother was reportedly cruel and emotionally vacant. Pearl was never shown love or comfort, and safety was a word foreign to this so-called family. By age 9, Pearl was already using Schedule II illegal substances, meaning according to the Controlled Substances Act, or CSA, at 9 years old, Pearl was using highly illegal street drugs. Highly addictive and dangerous street drugs weren't just present in her home. They were part of the atmosphere. Addiction hung in the air like dust. Where paraphernalia wasn't hidden, it was normalized. It was everywhere, on the countertops, tucked into drawers, and passed between adults like hors d'oeuvres at a party. And Pearl, still a child, watched and absorbed the darkness. Her childhood wasn't just troubled, it was a slow descent into chaos, neglect, and emotional starvation. Her father was in and out of jail, a revolving door of absence that left Pearl with no stable male figure to protect or guide her. Her mother, by most accounts, was a monster. There was no warmth in the household, no tenderness, no safety, just survival. Illegal substances became Pearl's escape, her armor, her way of numbing the pain that no child should ever have to carry. She wasn't just exposed to addiction, she was consumed by it before she even hit double digits. Her brain, still developing, was flooded with chemicals that distorted her reality and stunted her emotional growth. Pearl was surrounded by adults who were either high, coming down, or chasing their next fix. In that kind of environment, curiosity quickly turns into coping, and coping turns into dependency. According to court records and psychological evaluations, Pearl was horribly essayed as a child repeatedly. The details are sparse and the names of the perpetrators are often omitted or obscured, but what's clear is it was not a one-time event. It was sustained, invasive, and ignored. She was violated by people who should have been her protectors, family members, possibly others in her immediate environment. The exact age she was first assaulted isn't documented publicly, but the trauma was early and formative. It shaped her understanding of intimacy, trust, and power. It taught her that her body was not her own, that pain was something to be endured quietly, and that no one was coming to save her. Pearl ran away from home as a young teen. Some accounts suggest she was around 11 or 12 when she first fled, not because she was rebellious, but because she was desperate to escape the cruelty and chaos. But where do you go when the streets are just as dangerous as the home you left behind? She bounced between friends' houses, strangers, and temporary shelters. Sometimes she was gone for days, sometimes weeks, but she always ended up back home. And when she returned, the cruelty didn't stop. It continued, and the silence around it grew louder. And to this day, no one has ever been held accountable. Her mother didn't protect her. Her father was in and out of jail. Not once did CPS intervene. Not once did a teacher, a neighbor, or a doctor raise the alarm loud enough for the system to act. Pearl was invisible, and in that invisibility, her trauma metastasized. The irony is brutal. The very system that would later be blamed for failing Gabriel had already failed Pearl. This is not to excuse what Pearl became, but it is to say some people are born with darkness in them, and others are shaped by it, molded by the cruelty they endure, the silence they're forced to live in, and the systems that never show up. Some children survive the unimaginable and rise above it. Others wear the mask of survival so long they become what once hurt them, and the cycle of evil continues. Gabriel didn't stand a chance against this legacy. As Pearl entered adulthood, she hardened. She learned that love was conditional, that power came from fear, and that vulnerability was a weakness to be punished. So when she became a mother, she didn't cradle her children with tenderness. She controlled them. She manipulated systems, played the victim, and used motherhood as a weapon, never a refuge. Before Gabriel, there were others, children born into chaos, children Pearl brought into the world, but never truly mothered. Ezekiel, Virginia, and one unnamed child, each with a different story, but all tangled in the same web of neglect, manipulation, and survival. Pearl didn't raise them, she rotated them, between relatives, between homes, between systems that never asked enough questions. She showed up when it was convenient and when she needed control. You see, she never signed away her parental rights, so anyone caring for her children had their hands tied behind their backs when Pearl showed up. They had no legal recourse they could seek to keep the children and protect them from Pearl. So she could show up and rip the rug out from underneath her children at any time. She treated her children like property and used them like currency. She was more cruel and depraved to her babies than her mother ever was to her. There were so many reports to CPS, but there was very little effort to save or protect the children. One was removed temporarily, but it wasn't long before that child was sent right back into the lion's den. Then came Gabriel. On February 20th, 2005, Gabriel Fernandez was born. 8 pounds, 20 inches, a healthy baby boy with soft brown eyes and a quiet, searching gaze. But the room he entered wasn't filled with joy. It was filled with silence and tension. Pearl told the nurses she didn't want him. She said she couldn't care for another child. The nurses noticed immediately. Pearl was cold and detached. She never asked about Gabriel's weight or his health. She didn't want to see him. She told them flatly, "I don't want this baby," and would hand him back to the nurses like she was returning something she never ordered. Pearl left the hospital without Gabriel. She walked out with her discharge papers and a blank expression. No car seat, no diaper bag, and most importantly, no baby. Just a woman who had given birth and refused to look back. A few nurses filed concerns. They noted her behavior and they flagged the abandonment, but there was no formal custody transfer, no emergency intervention, just a quiet hope that someone would step in. Gabriel's biological father, Arnold Contreras, wasn't there when he was born. He was in jail. He had expressed enormous regrets over not being there for Gabriel as much as he should have. But Pearl would have made it extremely difficult for him to have much of a relationship with his son. Because of her need for control, she had already made up her mind as to Gabriel's fate. When she was pregnant, she expressed she didn't want another child. Gabriel's great uncle, Michael Carranza, and his partner, David Martinez, a same-sex couple, expressed their desire for a child and told Pearl if she had the baby, they would be honored to care for the child as if it was their own. Pearl agreed and decided she would give the baby to them to raise after she gave birth. There was no legal agreement, but Michael and David took her at her word, which begs the question, if Pearl had already made an agreement with her uncle and his partner, why did she abandon Gabriel at the hospital? It doesn't make much sense. But personally, I think it was her first act of cruelty to her son, denying him love and acceptance from the moment he came into this world. It's heart-wrenching and disgusting. At the end of the day, Michael and David took custody of Gabriel and raised him for 4 years with no issues. Gabriel seemed to be happy and thriving in their care. Then came the accusation they were being inappropriate with Gabriel. Both men have denied the claim, and it was never substantiated. But that led to Pearl's parents, Robert and Sandra Fernandez, using a ruse to take Gabriel away from the two men in 2009. It's reported that they disapproved of the couple's same-sex relationship, and the decision to remove Gabriel was not based on what was best for him, but rooted in prejudice. Because there was no binding legal agreement in place, Michael and David had their hands tied. There was nothing they could do. Sadly, Gabriel was taken from a reported nurturing home and placed with the very people who had created the trauma Pearl was born into. The same household that failed Pearl was now entrusted with raising her son. Was Gabriel better off with them? No. Not emotionally, not psychologically, not in any way that truly mattered. Although his grandparents may not have inflicted the same level of abuse Pearl eventually did, they were still part of the same broken legacy. Gabriel stayed with his grandparents for about 3 years, and in 2012 his life was turned upside down again when Pearl decided she wanted him to come live with her. She had been gathering up all her children like they were Easter eggs she was collecting in her basket. But why now? Was it guilt, a change of heart, some maternal instinct finally kicking in? No, it wasn't love or redemption. It wasn't anything close to that. Pearl didn't want all of her children back because she missed them. She wanted them back because of money. Bringing her children home meant more welfare benefits. They weren't children to her. They were a transaction. That decision may have added more money to Pearl's bank account, but it lost Gabriel everything. Gabriel was 7 years old when Pearl ripped him away from his grandparents and forced him to live with her. Although Gabriel loved Pearl and called her mom, he didn't know her. He had never lived with her. He spent the first 7 years of his life surrounded by people who, while imperfect, were familiar, predictable, and then out of nowhere he was ripped away and thrown into a living hell. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for him. I think back to when I was 7. My parents divorced. I didn't understand what was happening. I just knew everything felt wrong. I was sick for weeks, vomiting. Doctors couldn't figure it out. Eventually they said it was my nerves, my emotions, the stress of my world being turned upside down. And I wasn't being mistreated in any way. I was just a child trying to make sense of change. So when I think about Gabriel, this little boy who was suddenly handed over to a woman he barely knew, who had abandoned him at birth, I can't even imagine the fear, the confusion, the heartbreak. He must have felt so alone. He probably couldn't sleep, probably cried himself sick. And that, I'm afraid, was only the beginning. What came next wasn't just a nightmare. It was inhuman, the kind of sick and depraved acts you only hear about in horror films or from the darkest corners of history. Pearl was living in a modest apartment with her boyfriend, Isaro Aguirre, whom they called Tony. Unbeknownst to Gabriel, that apartment would become his prison, and Tony was its warden. Pearl didn't just see Tony as a boyfriend. She saw him as a protector, someone who could stand between her and the world she never learned to navigate. Psychological evaluations later revealed Pearl had the cognitive function of a child, struggling with comprehension, impulse control, and basic reasoning. It's been reported she saw Tony as someone who could protect her, but also as a tool she could manipulate and use to do her dirty work. Tony was a security guard. He wore a uniform. He had a job. To Pearl, that meant power, stability, and authority. Many people who knew Tony stated he had always been kind and gentle. For a time, he worked as a caregiver at a retirement home in Woodland Hills. His former employer described him as beloved by the elderly residents. Maybe he wore a mask. Maybe he wore it well. but behind it was a man capable of unspeakable cruelty. A man who didn't just follow Pearl's lead, he matched her step for step in brutality. Gabriel's abuse didn't explode overnight. It crept in quietly, insidiously. At first, it was a few bruises, a black eye, or a busted lip. Jennifer Garcia, Gabriel's first grade teacher at Summerwind Elementary School, started noticing his injuries and became extremely concerned. Gabriel came to school quiet, withdrawn, and at times with bruises that didn't make sense. His eyes looked sad and weary. He was only 8, but she could see he carried something heavy. One day he looked up at her with a question no teacher should ever hear. "Is it normal for moms to hit kids?" he said softly. "Is it normal for your mom to hit you with the part of the belt that has the metal thing on the end? Is it normal for you to bleed?" Jennifer froze. Gabriel's words were so specific. She knew in that moment that this was a child in danger. After school that day, she called the child abuse hotline and reported her concerns. Stephanie Rodriguez, an emergency response worker new to the department, was assigned to the case. At first, Jennifer felt reassured. Stephanie seemed responsive. She visited the Fernandez home, she spoke with Pearl, and looked at Gabriel. Shockingly, Stephanie noted that the children were, quote, appropriately dressed, that they appeared visibly healthy, and there were no marks or bruises. When Gabriel was asked about Jennifer's claims, he recanted. It's no wonder he did, since Stephanie interviewed him in front of Pearl. He was terrified of what would happen if he told the truth. So Stephanie dismissed the claims. Obviously, she should have not interviewed Gabriel in front of Pearl, and she should have taken Gabriel in for a medical exam. Had she done those things on her first visit, she could have saved Gabriel. But that would be too much work. It's just easier to walk away. This visit was in October of 2012, and sadly, Gabriel only had 7 months to live. He never even made it a year living with his mother. Gabriel knew he was the target of Pearl and Tony's rage. He was the scapegoat. His siblings had it rough, but weren't experiencing the escalating cruelty he was. But why Gabriel? Although we may never fully understand the complexities behind Pearl and Tony's motives, there are reports that lay out several contributing factors. Pearl never bonded with Gabriel. Some believe she resented the affection others showed him, especially her own parents. Gabriel had experienced love outside her home, and that love made him harder to break. It made him defiant in ways she couldn't tolerate. It made him a mirror of everything she wasn't. There have been reports that homophobia played a role, rooted in the fact that Gabriel had been raised by a gay relative. Gabriel was kind, gentle, loving in a way that radiated from him, even when he was surrounded by cruelty. But in Pearl and Tony's home, that tenderness was twisted into something to punish. Pearl saw that difference and despised it. Tony saw it and feared it. They accused Gabriel of being gay, not because he said anything, not because he understood what that meant, but because he was soft-spoken, because he played with dolls and showed affection, something terrifying and completely foreign to Pearl. In their eyes, that was unforgivable. They forced him to wear dresses. They mocked him relentlessly. They called him names no child should ever hear and humiliated him daily. There are also reports of a sexual component to Gabriel's abuse, something that speaks to the depravity of Pearl and Tony's relationship. Some experts suggest that their cruelty wasn't just about control or punishment. It was sexualized. It was performative and was used as a twisted form of foreplay. Gabriel's siblings later revealed that Pearl and Tony would laugh and flirt while harming Gabriel, then escalate the violence together, feeding off each other's cruelty in some sort of twisted, ritualized sadism. Gabriel became the object of their shared fantasy, one rooted in domination, humiliation, and control. They stripped him of his humanity. They made his suffering a spectacle, and they used it to fuel their intimacy. The apartment they were living in was a literal house of horrors and depravity. and Pearl and Tony's actions were escalating. So it's no wonder Gabriel denied he was being harmed. He was terrified. 1 month later, Genxr made another report to CPS regarding Gabriel. He had walked into class that morning with patches of his hair missing and raw spots on his scalp where it had been clearly yanked out. Gabriel also confided in Genxr that his mother had punched him in the face. Genxr was stunned. She picked up the phone again and called the child abuse hotline. She was connected once more to caseworker Stephanie Rodriguez. Genxr pleaded for action. She described the missing hair, the escalating signs of trauma, the fear in Gabriel's eyes. According to court testimony and investigative reporting, Stephanie told Gabriel's teacher that she had, quote, a regular visit scheduled with the family and that her arrival wouldn't appear to be triggered by any specific incident. Stephanie's approach was procedural, not urgent. She maintained that the children appeared, quote, appropriately dressed and visibly healthy, and that Gabriel had recanted his earlier statements during her visits. No forensic interview was conducted. No emergency removal was initiated. The visit, like others, was logged but ultimately ineffective. It became a part of the pattern, a system that documented Gabriel's suffering without intervening to stop it. In December of 2012, Gabriel arrived at school with a busted lip. Genxr made another report. Again, Stephanie was notified, but there was no intervention or documented follow-up. Outrage over CPS's lack of response to Gabriel was creeping up in Genxr. She was trying to keep it together, but it was getting difficult. She was literally watching an innocent child deteriorate before her eyes. She was taking the appropriate steps to save him, but was being ignored. Little did Genxr know, it was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. Pearl and Tony were locking Gabriel up in a makeshift cabinet that was located in their bedroom. According to court testimony from Gabriel's older brother Ezekiel, the cabinet was locked from the outside with handcuffs, and Gabriel would be gagged with a sock and bandana before being placed inside. While the exact position of the cabinet isn't explicitly confirmed in public records, it was reported to be in Pearl and Tony's bedroom, close enough that Pearl and Tony could hear Gabriel's cries, ignore him, and continue the cruelty. Ezekiel testified that Gabriel was forced to clean up after himself when he urinated or defecated inside the cabinet, and that he was punished if his siblings tried to help him. I can't imagine how Gabriel must have felt arriving at school day after day, facing his peers with the weight of the nightmares of sleeping in a cabinet the night before running through his head. School was the only place that felt remotely safe, but even that sanctuary came with its own torment because Gabriel had to sit beside other kids who had slept in warm beds, kids who had eaten breakfast, kids who didn't flinch when someone raised their voice. He had to pretend he was okay. Pretend he hadn't spent the night in a locked box, wondering if he'd ever come out. And still, he smiled sometimes. He tried to learn. He tried to be good, because maybe, just maybe, if he was good enough, someone would love him. That's the part that breaks you. Not just the violence, but the hope. The quiet, desperate hope of a little boy who kept showing up, even when the world kept failing him. As if the cabinet wasn't bad enough, the cruelty escalated. In January of 2013, Gabriel showed up to school with injuries to his face. He told Genxr he'd been shot with a BB gun. Genxr filed yet another report. This was now the fourth documented incident in less than 4 months. Stephanie still did not remove Gabriel from the home. She continued to cite lack of visible injuries and Gabriel's recanting during visits. Over the next 3 months, Gabriel's behavior deteriorated. He became more withdrawn. He stopped smiling and playing. Apparently, he had a therapist who he confided in. Gabriel told the therapist that he had been forced to perform inappropriate acts on a relative. The therapist reported it. She informed Stephanie and Stephanie's supervisor. Shockingly, the supervisor explicitly told the therapist not to call the child abuse hotline, fearing it would jeopardize the mother's participation in voluntary services. No formal report was filed by the therapist to the hotline under the pressure from CPS. No emergency response or home visit was initiated as a result of the therapist's concerns. The voluntary case was closed shortly afterward under pressure from Pearl, who requested closure after just 3 visits. The caseworker complied, stating there were no safety or risk factors. The supervisor signed off on the closure without even reading the file. Multiple visits had occurred prior to this, and each was handled abhorrently. Gabriel was interviewed with his mother present, violating policy and common sense. He recanted his statements under duress, and investigators accepted those recantations. No one spoke to neighbors or school staff beyond his teacher, despite widespread concern among school personnel. A predictive algorithm had flagged Gabriel as very high risk, but instead of escalating the case, CPS opted for voluntary services. The ideology of family preservation over child safety was dominant at this time, leading to fewer foster care placements and less intervention, even in high-risk cases. By May of 2013, Gabriel was no longer a child in danger. He was a child in crisis, trapped in a home that had become a chamber of horrors. The signs of his suffering weren't subtle. They screamed out in the form of physical injuries, from his silence, from the way he flinched when someone reached out to him. His body was a canvas of bruises, burns, and scars, each one a silent testimony to the agony he endured behind closed doors. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, was trying everything she could. She had called the authorities repeatedly, each time more desperate than the last, reporting the bruises, the broken spirit, the whispered confessions of pain. But her pleas were met with indifference. The system, designed to protect children like Gabriel, had turned away, and so the cruelty continued, uninterrupted, unchecked, and unimaginable. As if it couldn't get any worse, Gabriel was again let down by a system that should have protected him: law enforcement. There was a moment buried in the timeline, almost forgotten, when Gabriel was placed inside a sheriff's patrol car, not for protection, not for rescue, but for punishment. Gabriel had been screaming from the rooftops for help, he told his teacher and his therapist, but because he was always interviewed by CPS in front of the monsters who were harming him, he would recant for his own protection. He was just a little boy, and he was terrified. CPS should have known exactly what was going on. By all accounts, they are professionals in these cases. Law enforcement should have known better as well. But instead, they all went along with the narrative Pearl and Tony were concocting, that Gabriel was a liar, a boy who cried wolf. So on this particular occasion, when the sheriff's department was sent to the home, instead of saving Gabriel, they bullied him. They put this broken and terrified little boy in the back of the sheriff's cruiser and scolded him. They told him he better quit lying or he'd be in trouble with the law. The sheriff's department became another institution that gaslit Gabriel and shielded Pearl and Tony. They didn't take Gabriel to the hospital. They didn't open a criminal investigation. They didn't even file a report. They put Gabriel back in that house, back in the cabinet.
A year ago today, 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez lay dying in a hospital bed, allegedly beaten by his mother and her boyfriend. Now, after a year-long investigation, the sheriff's department confirms it has taken disciplinary action against as many as 6 deputies involved in the case.
There wasn't enough aggressive investigation.
John Scott was not sheriff when Gabriel was killed, but records show deputies were called out to the Fernandez home 5 times in the months preceding his death. 2 of those for suspected physical abuse, including a call just weeks before his murder from a security guard. Gabriel's sibling would later tell investigators Gabriel's face was deformed, covered in bruises.
In one instance, the child was asleep or reportedly asleep. But those kind of bruises and those kind of injuries should be an awareness that there's something occurring that shouldn't have occurred.
The Sheriff's Department says it can't discuss details, citing personnel issues, but we're told no one will be fired and describe the deputy's missteps as minor. From DCFS documents we obtained through court order, we know that the abuse call from the security guard was never reported to DCFS, a violation of department policy and state law.
Did you think the Sheriff's Department let Gabriel down?
Unfortunately, yes.
Retired LASD Sergeant Dan Scott, no relation to the sheriff, was part of the Blue Ribbon Commission formed to make recommendations in the wake of Gabriel's death.
The sheriff has to send the message to every captain, every lieutenant, commanders, chiefs, that child abuse is going to be taken seriously, or we're going to end up with more Gabriel Fernandezes.
In those final weeks, Gabriel was no longer allowed to attend school. Pearl and Tony kept him home, isolating him from the only place where he had once felt safe. They locked him in the cabinet for hours, sometimes overnight, surrounded by his own waste. They shot him with a BB gun, aiming for his face, his groin, his chest. They used a bat, belt, and pepper spray for even more punishment. They burned him and forced him to eat cat litter and feces. When it made him sick, they made him eat his own vomit. By mid-May, his little body was failing. Then came May 22nd. That night, Gabriel didn't clean up his toys. That was the trigger. That was all it took. Pearl and Tony unleashed on him with a fury that defies comprehension. And when his tiny body finally collapsed, they called 911. Not out of remorse, but because they knew he was dying. He didn't get up this time, or even try to. He wasn't moving, which I'm sure frustrated them. I mean, they couldn't have any more fun terrorizing an innocent child. Calling 911 was not done to save Gabriel. The call was made because they didn't know what to do with his body.
911 emergency.
Yes, I would like to, my son is not breathing.
Your son is what?
He's not breathing.
Hold on 1 second. I'm going to transfer you over to the fire department. Don't hang up.
My son is 8 years old.
It's your son, okay. And he's not breathing?
No.
Is he having a seizure?
No, he was wrestling with my other son, and I came in and he just was unconscious.
Okay, do you have the paramedics on the way right now? Are you right there with him?
Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, do you know how to do CPR?
I'm just doing the compulsion from the chest right now.
Okay, you need to breathe for him. If he's not breathing, you need to do 2 breaths and 30 compressions. Just need you to keep doing that until the paramedics come, okay? They're on their way. They're coming as fast as they can.
Paramedics arrived to find Gabriel naked, unresponsive, lying on the floor of their Palmdale apartment. They kept their composure but were horrified by what they saw. One paramedic later testified, "It was like every inch of this child had been injured." Another stated that at first he thought Gabriel might have some sort of skin disease because of the head-to-toe burns and injuries. Pearl and Tony showed no emotion as first responders worked to save Gabriel. They were able to stabilize him enough to rush him to Antelope Valley Hospital, where emergency teams took over his care. Gabriel's condition weighed heavy on them. They'd never seen anything like it. Some have said they later broke down after seeing a child with so many injuries, wondering how any human could do that to a child. They too did what they could for Gabriel. Then he was flown to Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, where doctors declared him brain dead soon after arrival. He was put on life support, but his little body just couldn't take any more. And 2 days later, on May 24th, 2013, Gabriel Fernandez died. He was cremated and rests with family members. This decision was made by his great-uncle, who testified during the trial and explained that the family chose cremation because they didn't want anyone else to have to see Gabriel like that. After the unimaginable suffering he endured, they wanted to protect what little dignity they could preserve in death. Though Gabriel doesn't have a traditional gravesite, his memory lives on through several public tributes in Palmdale. There is the Gabriel Fernandez Memorial Tree at 249 East Avenue Q10 in Palmdale, California. There's the Gabriel Fernandez Memorial Mural at the intersection of 3rd Street East and Palmdale Boulevard. There is also a Facebook page, Gabriel's Justice, a space for advocacy and remembrance. For days after Gabriel's death, the silence was deafening. Although it deeply affected Gabriel's teacher, every first responder on scene, and medical staff that tried to save him, there was no media coverage, so the public had no idea of the horrors he suffered and the straight-up criminal actions of the LA County CPS system. Inside the LA Times newsroom, editors dismissed the story. These cases were tragically common, they said. This one didn't merit the ink. But one reporter, Garrett Therolf, refused to let Gabriel's death be buried beneath bureaucracy and indifference. Garrett had seen the coroner's report and read the emergency room notes. He had spoken to the teachers who had called in desperate pleas for help. And what he saw wasn't just a murder. It was a slow-motion betrayal, orchestrated by the very agencies sworn to protect children like Gabriel. He began to dig, not knowing how deep the rot went. Every phone call led to another horror. Every document revealed another missed opportunity. Gabriel had been flagged in their systems as high risk. He had told adults he was being hurt. And still, social workers closed his case. They interviewed Gabriel with Pearl and Tony in the room. They falsified records. They ignored the warnings. Garrett kept pushing. He filed public records requests. He interviewed prosecutors, paramedics, therapists, and teachers. He fought resistance from inside his own newsroom, where editors questioned whether the story was worth pursuing. But he knew it was. He knew Gabriel's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the inevitable result of a system that had stopped caring. And when the story finally broke, it shattered everything. The public was horrified, not just by the torture Gabriel endured, but by the cold, calculated negligence of CPS. The story exposed how they ignored more than 60 separate reports of abuse. And it showed, in excruciating detail, how a child could be brutalized for months while the system looked the other way. Garrett's reporting didn't just inform, it ignited. He cracked open a sealed vault of institutional failure and forced the city to look inside. He gave Gabriel a voice louder than the silence that had swallowed him. And in doing so, he made sure that the world would never again be able to say, "We didn't know." While Gabriel was on life support in the hospital, Pearl and Tony were arrested. At first, the charges were felony child endangerment and attempted murder. But when Gabriel died 2 days later, the charges escalated to first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture, a legal designation reserved for the most heinous, calculated acts of cruelty. Pearl was cold and detached during questioning, offering little explanation for her depraved actions. Tony, on the other hand, admitted to some of the violence, but claimed he never meant to kill Gabriel. Their stories were riddled with contradictions, but the evidence was overwhelming. The trial became a crucible of grief and fury. Pearl, facing the death penalty, chose to plead guilty. She accepted a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, she offered a statement, brief, emotionless, and devoid of true remorse.
I want to say I'm sorry for my family for what I did. I want to say I'm sorry for this, what happened. I wish Gabriel was alive. Every day, I wish that I made better choices.
Her defense painted her as a woman shaped by trauma, addiction, and neglect. But the prosecution reminded the court that none of that justified the systematic torture of her own child. Tony, however, went to trial. And what unfolded in that courtroom was a slow, agonizing unraveling of every moment Gabriel had suffered. Prosecutors presented photos, medical records, and testimony that painted Tony not just as a violent man, but as someone who derived pleasure from Gabriel's pain. Gabriel's siblings described how Tony would laugh while injuring their brother, how he forced him to eat cat litter and feces, how he bound and gagged him, made him sleep in a cabinet, and shot him with a BB gun. The jury sat through it all, stone-faced, horrified, and silent. They heard how Tony believed Gabriel was gay and used that as justification for his cruelty. The jury saw the autopsy photos. They listened to Gabriel's siblings describe the cruelty, and when the verdict came down, it was unanimous. Guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. The judge accepted their recommendation for the death penalty. As of the date of this video, Tony remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. However, California has not carried out an execution since 2006. The state currently has a moratorium on the death penalty. That means while Tony is legally sentenced to death, it's unlikely he will be executed anytime soon, if ever. So in effect, he's serving a de facto life sentence on death row, but the legal designation remains death. One juror who chose to remain anonymous described the experience as emotionally devastating. They said the evidence presented during the trial was so graphic and so disturbing that it left a permanent mark on them. The juror said, quote, "I will never forget what I saw. I will never forget Gabriel. I don't think any of us will." They described Tony as evil and said the decision to sentence him to death was not taken lightly, but ultimately they felt it was the only appropriate response to the level of cruelty he inflicted on Gabriel. One juror reportedly broke down in tears during deliberations, and others expressed that they had trouble sleeping throughout the trial. Deputy DA Jonathan Hatami, who prosecuted the case, also spoke about the jury's reaction. He said they were visibly shaken. You could see it in their faces. They understood the gravity of what they were being asked to do. The jury's unanimous verdict reflected not just a legal conclusion, but a moral reckoning. They saw through the defense's argument that Tony had acted in a moment of rage. They saw the pattern, the intent, and the sadism, and they chose justice. But the air in the courtroom remained heavy, because while Tony would face death and Pearl would spend the rest of her life behind bars, there was a deeper, more insidious truth that still lingered in the shadows. Gabriel had not been murdered in secret. He had been murdered in plain sight, and the people who were supposed to save him looked away. The outrage that followed Tony's sentencing didn't stop at the prison gates. It surged outward, crashing against the walls of the LA County CPS. The public demanded answers. In April of 2016, about 3 years after Gabriel's death, 4 DCFS employees were charged with felony child abuse and falsifying public records. Their names were now etched into the narrative. Stephanie Rodriguez, the social worker who visited Gabriel's home and failed to act. Patricia Clement, who took over the case and allegedly minimalized the signs of escalating abuse. Kevin Baum and Gregory Merritt, their supervisors, who signed off on decisions that would ultimately leave Gabriel in the hands of his killers. The charges were unprecedented and necessary. Never before had social workers in California been criminally prosecuted for failing to protect a child. The DA's office argued that these individuals had acted with willful disregard for human life, that they falsified records, ignored mounting evidence, and closed Gabriel's case despite glaring red flags. They allegedly omitted critical details from their internal reports, including Gabriel's visible injuries and his statements about abuse. They misrepresented the outcomes of home visits, claiming the children appeared healthy and safe despite mounting evidence to the contrary. They closed the case prematurely, stating there were no safety concerns, even as Gabriel's condition visibly deteriorated. One of the most egregious acts was the decision to close Gabriel's case just weeks before his death, despite multiple active reports and a predictive risk algorithm that had flagged him as very high risk. The closure was signed off without reconciling conflicting information and without conducting a proper forensic interview or medical evaluation. Prosecutors laid out the timeline: how Stephanie had visited the home after reports that Gabriel had been shot with a BB gun and yet failed to order a medical exam. How Patricia Clement had received multiple warnings from Gabriel's teacher, who described bruises, burns, and Gabriel's own pleas for help. How Kevin Baum and Gregory Merritt had approved the closure of the case without reconciling the contradiction in their staff's reports. The defense argued that these workers were overwhelmed, under-resourced, and scapegoated by a system that had failed long before Gabriel's file landed on their desks. But the judge wasn't swayed. He called Gabriel's death foreseeable. He said the social workers had demonstrated an improper regard for human life. For a moment, it seemed the system itself might be held accountable. But we can't have that, can we? No, in 2020, those charges were dismissed. The appellate court ruled that the workers did not have legal custody of Gabriel and therefore could not be held criminally liable. Unbelievable. There are moments in history when the cruelty of a system becomes so unbearable, so grotesquely indifferent, that it forces us to ask not just how it happened, but who could have possibly let it happen. And in the case of Gabriel Fernandez, an innocent 8-year-old boy from Palmdale, California, tortured to death by the very people who were supposed to love him, the answer is as chilling as the crime itself. It wasn't just his mother and her boyfriend who killed him. It was the system. It was the state. It was the social workers who saw his injuries, heard his cries, read the reports, and still chose silence. Gabriel was not invisible. He was not hidden away in some forgotten corner of society. He was in plain sight, and yet the people at CPS, the ones whose job it was to protect him, looked at this child, a small, broken boy with BB pellets lodged in his skin and burns on his body, and decided he was nothing more than a case to be closed, a problem to be erased, gum on their shoe. There was no remorse, no reckoning, no public apology. The social workers who erased Gabriel's suffering from the record walked away without a single day in prison. The charges, felony child abuse, and falsifying public records were dismissed. I ask, if the charges for child abuse were dropped because Gabriel wasn't in CPS custody, what about the charges for falsifying records? I do not accept that these monsters couldn't have at least been held accountable for that egregious crime. But the system can't do that. Otherwise, it might set a precedence to hold social workers throughout the country accountable for their actions or lack thereof that have led to the deaths of thousands of vulnerable children. So, the court ruled they didn't have legal custody of Gabriel, so they couldn't be held criminally liable. And just like that, the system exhaled, dusted off its hands, and moved on. But Gabriel didn't move on. He was silenced. And so were Anthony Avalos and Noah Cuatro, who I covered in part 1 and 2 of this docuseries. 2 more children from the Antelope Valley who died in eerily similar circumstances. Since Gabriel's death in 2013, at least 23 children have died in the Antelope Valley alone due to abuse and neglect. That's 21 deaths per 100,000 children, the highest rate in all of LA County. And still, the headlines fade, the outrage cools, the system remains. Antelope Valley is still the same broken place it was back then, a region plagued by a culture of bureaucratic indifference that treats child welfare like a box to be checked, not a life to be saved. And while we funnel billions of tax dollars to foreign governments, our own children are dying in their own homes, their cries drowned out by the hum of political convenience. This is a humanitarian crisis, a domestic atrocity, and it will keep happening until we stop allowing the government to bury its sins beneath redacted documents and sanitized press releases. That's why we tell Gabriel's story. That's why we scream Noah's name. That's why we refuse to let Anthony be forgotten, because the littlest victims are the easiest to silence, and we will not let them be erased. The response from CPS was a mix of silence and deflection. Though it took years and intense public pressure, CPS did eventually issue a formal statement acknowledging the horror of Gabriel Fernandez's death and the agency's failure to protect him. Their hollow public statement only came after the Netflix docuseries, The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, was released, igniting more public scrutiny and demands for reform. The statement said, quote, "What happened to Gabriel was horrific and inhumane. No child should ever suffer such abuse and neglect at the hands of a caregiver. It should never take the death of a child to address weaknesses and make investments in improvements for child protection." That was it. That was all they had to say. The 4 CPS employees involved, Stephanie Rodriguez, Patricia Clement, Kevin Baum, and Gregory Merritt, were fired and criminally charged, though the charges were later dismissed, as we just discussed. Their responses varied. Gregory Merritt stated in interviews that he didn't believe he could have done anything more and denied wrongdoing. Stephanie Rodriguez claimed other children on her caseload were in equal or greater danger, implying Gabriel's case wasn't exceptional. Patricia Clement broke down during questioning and said she had nothing to do with Gabriel's death and did not offer a public apology. Kevin Baum declined to comment publicly. What's the common thread in all of these public responses? No humility, no apology to Gabriel directly, no sadness expressed for this horrific suffering. It makes me wonder if they are even human. I hope Gabriel haunts them. I hope they never sleep, and every day they wake up, a dark cloud follows them wherever they go. In my opinion, they should all have been made to suffer publicly as Gabriel did, locked in boxes in the public square, humiliated daily for everyone to see, allowed to suffer while being injured with bats, pepper spray, and BB guns, then put back in their boxes for the evening. This should have gone on as long as it would take for death to consume them, Pearl and Tony included. Maybe that's what it would take to hear apologies from any of them. Maybe that's what it would take to stop all of this. Were there any charges to CPS after Gabriel's death? No, none. The same toxic culture continued, and I have proof. Part 1 and 2 of this docuseries. Anthony and Noah are proof. Anthony Avalos died 5 years later. Noah Cuatro died 1 year after Anthony. They had 5 years to make improvements after Gabriel, and they did nothing. Just hollow promises of reform in a few newspaper articles. I just can't. I have to be honest. Covering these 3 precious boys for the last month has gutted me. 1 minute I'm screaming inside with rage, and the next I'm wiping my tears when I look at their precious faces. I don't know how much I can possibly do to change anything, but I'm trying. I'm trying to make sure no one forgets. I'm trying to build a platform and coalition big enough to be heard. It's so frustrating to watch, so infuriating that the systems that are supposed to protect our children are nothing but rot with no accountability. If this docuseries has touched you and you'd like to join me in the fight for change, please go to inspectorgenxr.com. There I've listed petitions you can sign that align with our mission, and there are other ways you can support us there. You can enter your email address to join, where we'll keep you posted on what we're doing behind the scenes and ways you can help. You'll never be spammed. I barely have time to breathe most days, much less send out a bunch of emails. So your inbox can rest assured it won't be inundated with emails from us. There are links to our podcast there as well. We really need your help to push out our podcast to more listeners and spread our message. If you're on the go or multitasking, a listen, rate, and review goes a long way in helping us grow in that space. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone who has subscribed, commented words of kindness, supported us on Patreon and YouTube. You are what keeps me going, and your words of kindness truly make a difference on the days I feel like giving up on all of this. I'm sending love and light to all of you. Thank you. Gabriel Fernandez was 8 years old when he died, his body broken, his spirit crushed, his voice silenced by the very people who were supposed to love him. For 8 months, he endured a slow, methodical descent into hell and told he wasn't worthy of love. And yet he kept showing up to school. He kept trying to be good. He kept hoping someone would save him, but no one did. 5 years later, in the same broken stretch of desert known as Antelope Valley, another little boy named Anthony Avalos would suffer a fate so eerily similar it felt like deja vu. 10 years old, full of promise, full of light, Anthony was tortured by his mother and her boyfriend, forced to kneel on rice until his knees bled, whipped, dropped on his head, denied food and water until his little body gave out. His death came slowly, over days of agony, while CPS once again stood by and did nothing. And then came Noah Cuatro, just 4 years old, who smiled with his whole face and loved to chase butterflies. A judge had signed an order for his removal that CPS illegally ignored. Because of that, Noah is dead. 3 boys, 3 names, 3 funerals, all within the same county, all under the same system, all after repeated warnings, red flags, and desperate cries for help. Gabriel, Anthony, Noah. They weren't just failed, they were erased, treated like burdens, like paperwork, like gum on the shoe of a system too busy, too broken, too indifferent to care. We tell these stories not to relive the pain, but to demand change. We speak Gabriel's name, Anthony's name, Noah's name, not because we enjoy the heartbreak, but because silence is complicity. Because every time we say their names, we remind the world that these 3 boys mattered, that their lives were worth fighting for, that their deaths must mean something. So let this be the final frame, not of despair, but of defiance. Let it be the moment we stop asking how this happened and start demanding why it keeps happening. Let it be the moment we stop waiting for reform and start building it ourselves. Let it be the moment we vow together that no more children will be buried under the weight of our indifference. Gabriel, Anthony, Noah, we see you, we remember you, and we will never stop telling your story.